Hey everybody, and welcome to the intersection of sports and marketing. I'm Cristiano, and this is OUTOFSCOPE episode number 29, the old business generation versus the new one. All you marketers out there need to listen to this.
Sports marketing expert Cristiano.
Cristiano.
Marketers and advertisers and brands always have to keep in mind, you have to play to the state of your audience. Endurance sports athletes are absolutely fanatics.
Having a Facebook page doesn't get you any business, but doing it right can be quite effective.
So this episode is a little bit more of an observation of mine, right? I'm kind of in this middle zone of the old generation of business, which I picture as, old men with white hair around a boardroom table making fist-pounding decisions, versus the new generation of really young entrepreneurs behind a computer creating some sort of software or platform or service or SaaS software, something like that, right? And I think they're so different, and I think I fall somewhere in the middle, and I respect both sides, but it kind of occurred to me to take a look at both and say, all right, like why did the old generation work, and is it continuing to work, or is it failing? And is the new generation as strong as the old generation, and is it booming because they're better or smarter, or it's just different? And what I found is that the old generation worked for a period of time, but it is very clear that old generation of thought process, the old fist pounding on a boardroom table, top-down management style with 7 or 10 different layers of corporate in between the people on the ground actually doing the work, I don't believe really works now, and it will work less and less over the coming decades. I think it worked very well, up until really the early 2000s, where connectivity became instantaneous via the internet and software platforms, and giving people access to information and data and thought processes that before were really consolidated in companies that were big enough to be able to afford that. And now anybody, myself, you, anybody in the world can access any amount of data that they really want at the click of a button almost instantaneously. And that removes a lot of that middle corporate structure that had existed for so long and still exists to this day in a lot of big companies. I think that it worked well because, going back 30, 40, 50 years, even 20 years ago, you really needed that person who was commanding the ship, that general, to say, this is what I want and this is how you go get it. And you kind of had to have your little armies of people in between to execute that and have other people execute it, and so on and so forth. And you needed this mass amount of people, these mass amount of resources to go and get things done. The problem for that structure, the problem for the old thought process, is they think that still works, and they're not willing, or they can't figure out how to change that mental state and say, hey, you know what, we need to consolidate this, and not necessarily get rid of people, but figure out how to utilize their talents better, more efficiently, in a more lateral sense, instead of top-down, heavy architecture of a corporation. And the problem with that big structure is they can't adapt to trends so quickly. It has to go through so many layers of corporate before it gets to the top, before the person can hammer, the CEO can hammer their fist on the boardroom table. Now, I'm not saying every large company is like that. There are some large companies that are very progressive and are doing very well, but I think that's kind of the tendency of big companies that have done that in the past and are still doing it today. On the flip side of that coin, I think are the very young tech entrepreneurs that can create software, can create ideas on a laptop somewhere in a Starbucks. And it's the whole other side of the mentality, which is hire young people with good brains, let them do their jobs. We don't really want this huge corporate structure. we don't need huge HR departments and research departments. Everybody kind of is their own person in caps wearing multiple hats. And I think for this new generation of business people, that also works very well because you can move faster. You allow people to take on multiple roles. They feel a little more fulfilled because they impact the company in a bigger space, which I think is fantastic. The problem that I see on that side of the table is they kind of expect, and I don't mean they as in everyone. Obviously, I'm not talking about Mark Zuckerberg. He's a freaking brilliant human being who also understands how to run a brilliant company. But I'm talking about the very small, the idea of that I can sit in a coffee shop and become a millionaire or run a company. I think, yes, does it have merit? Absolutely. But I think on the flip side of the coin, there very much is this I deserve mentality from the younger generation that feels that, hey, well, I sat in Starbucks for the last year and a half, so I deserve something to happen. Whereas that old school general mentality was, I'm working 20 hours a day or 23 hours a day, and I don't care, and we're going to be here until we figure it out, also has equal merit. And I think somewhere in the middle really is the sweet spot, which is you don't want this general type of person pounding their fists and telling everyone what has to be. I think that person, that role, you still need this really clear leader, this visionary of a company, but they can be more flexible and take the input from the people that work around them instead of below them and incorporate them into the fold of the decision making, but still have the balls to stand up to say, no, this is what needs to be done, and here's how it's going to happen. You can remove the fist pounding from the equation, but there still needs to be that leadership. And I think that's what's interesting to me is there's two very big extremes. Now there's some companies in the middle, of course, that are doing it very well. But looking at the extremes is very interesting to me. This young culture of, well, I put some work in so I deserve a lot, and this old school culture of you work until the day you die, everything needs to be, if you're not working hard, you're not working at all. And I think it's very interesting that there's two very extreme parallels kind of happening at the same time. And I think that I'm lucky, and hopefully everyone out there is lucky to be a part of this right now because I get to observe both sides of that spectrum. We work with companies that are very big and have large structures, and we work with companies that are very new and fresh and are pretty much still in startup mode. And it's really cool to see and to take pieces from each and say, hey, I see why this works. I see why having somebody at top leadership that can make an executive decision, I see why that's important. While at the same time, I see why letting people do their jobs and empowering them to be, independent thinkers is more powerful than creating multiple armies of non-thinkers that just execute your vision. And I think that's what's interesting to me as a business owner is, and I'm constantly learning every day, looking at those two extremes and seeing, well, there's clearly really good ideas on both sides of that table. What can I take from both of those, put together in my own way, extract the really good execution out of both sides of that, and try to come up with some sort of a hybrid. And I think that's what we're going to start to see over the next decade or two. Are companies that really try to balance that role, which is hire people that are super smart, allow them to do their jobs, give them free will, give them the tools to allow them to expand themselves in their own role, but still having some structure that at the end of the day, there's somebody to say, hey, this is what needs to happen and why. So somebody to make that decision. And I think it's very interesting, right? I think it's kind of cool that we're in this middle time where I've lived through that, I'm living through this, and there's probably going to be 5 or 6 other changes in the next 30, 40, 50 years. Who knows? But I just like to really look at that and try to say, okay, what can I learn from this? And I think those two extremes are very interesting to me. So I'd love to kind of hear what anybody thinks about that. Anybody that works in either one of those structures, it's very corporate and has that very big boardroom and decisions are only made in there in closed doors, and or people that work in a very small, super startup-y, there are no rules kind of environment. I'd love to hear, maybe somebody has been in both, I'd love to hear feedback and thoughts on what you liked and didn't like about either, and maybe you've drawn some parallels on meeting the two in the middle. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Looking forward to putting out some more episodes. Also looking forward to being out in Utah soon. All right, take care. Bum, 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 bum.